My name is Grace, and at 34 years old, I watched my father choose a business lunch over my emergency room call. That single text message would cost him everything he'd spent 40 years building. As blood pooled beneath my hospital bed from the accident his business partner caused, Dad was clinking champagne glasses 3 blocks away. He had no idea that in exactly 72 hours, his entire empire would crumble, and I would be the one holding the match. Before we dive into this incredible story of betrayal and redemption, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Are you someone who's experienced family betrayal? Have you ever felt abandoned by those who should protect you? Please hit that like button if you believe family should always come first, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories that will leave you speechless. Share this with someone who needs to hear that choosing money over family always comes with a price. Now, let me tell you exactly how my father's greed destroyed everything he held dear. I had always been Daddy's little girl, or so I thought. As a successful architect in downtown Chicago, I'd built my career on the foundation my father Robert had laid. He owned a $50 million construction company, and I'd grown up on job sites, learning to read blueprints before I could properly tie my shoes. That Tuesday morning, I drove to one of his newest projects, a 40-story luxury apartment complex, to meet with his business partner Victor about some concerning structural modifications I'd noticed in the plans. Victor had been with my father for 15 years, practically family at every holiday dinner and celebration. When I arrived at the construction site, he was waiting on the 10th floor, his usual charming smile replaced with something darker. I pulled out the blueprints, pointing to the areas where cheaper materials had been substituted without proper documentation. His face changed completely when he realized I'd discovered his embezzlement scheme. The conversation escalated quickly, and before I could react, Victor shoved me hard toward the scaffolding. My heel caught on a loose board, and I tumbled backward through the safety barrier, falling 12 feet onto the concrete platform below. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. My vision blurred as I felt warm liquid spreading beneath me. Through the haze, I could hear workers shouting and running toward me. Someone called 911 while another held my head steady, telling me not to move. In the ambulance, fighting to stay conscious, I managed to pull out my phone and dial my father's number. It rang once, twice, 3 times before going to voicemail. I tried again. This time he picked up, but I could hear restaurant noise and laughter in the background. "Dad," I gasped, struggling to form words through the pain, "I'm in an ambulance. There was an accident at the Riverside project. Please, I need you." The line was silent for a moment before I heard him sigh with irritation. "Grace, I'm in the middle of a crucial lunch meeting with the Japanese investors. Can't this wait?" I tried to explain, but he cut me off. "Text me the details. I'll have Nancy handle whatever you need." The line went dead. 20 minutes later, as nurses rushed me into surgery prep, my phone buzzed. A text from Dad read simply, "I'm at lunch. Can't leave. Nancy will come." That was it. No questions about my injuries, no concern in his words, just cold dismissal. As they wheeled me toward the operating room, I sent him one final message: internal bleeding. Emergency surgery. Could die. His response came 30 seconds later: "Stop being dramatic. I'll check in after my meeting." Nancy, my father's secretary of 20 years, arrived just as they were taking me into surgery. Her face was pale with worry, a stark contrast to my father's indifference. She held my hand and promised to stay until I woke up. "Your father is with the Yamamoto Group," she explained quietly, as if that justified everything. "It's a $40 million deal." I wanted to laugh at the irony, but the anesthesia was already pulling me under. When I woke up 6 hours later, the doctor's face was grave. Multiple fractures in my left leg, 3 broken ribs, a punctured lung, and internal bleeding that had required 2 transfusions. "Another hour and we might have lost you," he said softly. "You're incredibly lucky someone called when they did." Lucky? I stared at the ceiling, processing how close I'd come to death while my father ate sushi and discussed profit margins. That's when Carlos knocked on my door. He was one of the construction workers who'd witnessed everything, a quiet man I'd seen on sites for years but never really spoken to. "Miss Grace," he said in accented English, "I need to tell you something. What happened today, it wasn't an accident. I saw Mr. Victor push you. And that's not all I've seen." He pulled out his phone, hands shaking slightly. "I've been documenting things for months, hoping someone would listen. Your father's partner, he's been stealing. And I think he wanted to silence you before you could expose him." Carlos sat in the uncomfortable hospital chair, his weathered hands clutching a worn folder filled with evidence that would change everything. Over the past 18 months, he'd photographed altered invoices, recorded conversations between Victor and suppliers, and documented materials that never arrived at job sites but were marked as delivered and paid for. The scope of the embezzlement was staggering. Nearly $3 million siphoned off through ghost purchases and inflated costs. "I tried to tell your father once," Carlos admitted, his voice heavy with frustration. "He said Victor handles the finances and to mind my own business. But I knew something was wrong when Victor started meeting with lawyers and accountants your father didn't know about. He showed me blurry photos of Victor entering the offices of Steinberg and Associates, a firm known for hostile takeovers and corporate raids." The pieces were falling into place like a horrifying puzzle. My mother Diane burst through the hospital door then, her usually perfect composure completely shattered. She'd driven 3 hours from her sister's house in Milwaukee when Nancy called her. "Where is he?" she demanded, her voice shaking with rage. "Where's your father?" When I told her about the lunch meeting and his texts, something broke in her carefully maintained facade. For the first time in my life, I saw my mother cry with fury rather than sadness. 27 years, she said, sinking into the chair beside my bed. 27 years of putting his business first. Missed birthdays, anniversaries, your brother's graduation. Always another deal, another meeting, another million to make. She pulled out her phone and showed me a credit card statement. "I hired a private investigator last month. Want to know what your precious father has been doing during his late-night business meetings?" The photos made my stomach turn. My father with a woman I recognized immediately, Lydia, Victor's wife. The timestamps showed dates spanning back 2 years. Romantic dinners, weekend getaways to Vegas, even a trip to Paris that he'd told us was a construction conference. The betrayal felt like another physical blow, adding to the pain already coursing through my body. "Victor knows," my mother continued, her voice now cold and calculated. "He's known for months. The investigator found out he's been building a case for corporate malfeasance while using the affair as leverage. He's planning to take everything, the company, our assets, our reputation. And your father is too blinded by his ego and his mistress to see it coming." That's when Uncle Michael walked in. My mother's brother was a forensic accountant who'd worked with the FBI on corporate fraud cases. Diane had called him during her drive, and he'd immediately flown in from Washington. "I've been reviewing the files Carlos provided," he said without preamble. "This goes deeper than embezzlement. There's evidence of tax evasion, money laundering through offshore accounts, and RICO violations that could bring federal charges. Robert's been signing off on falsified documents for years." My head spun trying to process everything. My father wasn't just negligent, he was potentially a criminal. And Victor wasn't just stealing, he was orchestrating a complete takeover using my father's illegal activities and infidelity as weapons. But the worst revelation was yet to come. Nancy, who'd been standing quietly by the window, finally spoke up. "There's something else you need to know," she said, wringing her hands. "I've been trying to protect you all, but I can't anymore. Victor has someone inside the office feeding him information. Every move your father makes, every document he signs, Victor knows about it immediately." She paused, then dropped the bombshell. "It's James. Your brother has been working with Victor for the past 6 months." The room went silent. James, my younger brother who'd joined the company straight out of college, who'd always competed for Dad's attention and approval, had turned traitor. Nancy explained how she'd caught him copying confidential files and overheard phone calls where he discussed his future position once Victor took control. The promise of being named CEO had been enough to make him betray his own family. My phone buzzed with a text. It was from my father. Meeting went well. Closed the deal. I'll stop by tomorrow if I have time. If he had time. I was lying in a hospital bed with a punctured lung and multiple fractures, having barely survived an attempted murder, and my father would visit if his schedule allowed. The rage that filled me was stronger than any painkiller they'd given me. Carlos offered to call the police, but I stopped him. No, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. If Victor and my father want to play corporate games, then let's play. But we're going to play by my rules now. 3 days passed before my father finally graced me with his presence. I was in the middle of a physical therapy session, learning to transfer from bed to wheelchair with my leg and a complicated external fixator, when he strolled in carrying a bouquet of grocery store flowers. His designer suit was immaculate, his silver hair perfectly styled, and his expression showed more annoyance than concern, as if visiting his injured daughter was just another item on his busy schedule. You look better than Nancy described, he said, setting the flowers on the nightstand without even looking at me. She made it sound like you were at death's door. I had to reschedule a golf game with the mayor for this. No asking how I felt. No apology for taking 3 days to visit. No acknowledgement that I'd almost died while he was eating $30 salmon rolls. Just irritation at the inconvenience I'd caused him. I waited until he sat down, then locked eyes with him. I know about the embezzlement, Dad. I know about the falsified invoices, the tax evasion, and the offshore accounts. I also know about Lydia. His face went through several shades of red before settling on purple. He started to speak, but I raised my hand. I'm not finished. I know Victor pushed me because I discovered his theft. I know he's planning a hostile takeover. And I know James is helping him. Robert stood up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. You don't know what you're talking about, he spat, pointing a finger at me. You've always been too nosy for your own good, sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. This is exactly why I don't include you in business decisions. You're too emotional, too naive to understand how the real world works. The gaslighting was so familiar it almost felt comfortable, like slipping into an old, toxic rhythm we'd danced for years. Is that what you told yourself when you were in bed with your business partner's wife? I asked calmly. That it was just how the real world works? Or when you signed off on invoices for materials that never existed? Was that just good business too? His face contorted with rage, and for a moment, I thought he might actually strike me. Then my mother walked in, followed by Uncle Michael and a woman I didn't recognize. Hello, Robert, Diane said coolly. I'd like you to meet Barbara Chen, my divorce attorney. We have some papers for you to review. She handed him a thick envelope while his mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Oh, and before you start lying again, you should know that Barbara has copies of everything, the affair evidence, the fraudulent documents, and especially interesting, the records of your second family in Miami. The silence that followed was deafening. I stared at my mother, then at my father, trying to process what I'd just heard. Second family? Miami? Robert's shoulders sagged, and for the first time in my life, I saw him look defeated. It's not what you think, he started, but Diane cut him off with a bitter laugh. Brandon is 17 years old, she announced, each word sharp as a blade. You've been sending his mother $30,000 a month for 17 years. That's not a brief indiscretion, Robert. That's a complete double life. She turned to me, her eyes softening. I'm sorry you had to find out this way, sweetheart. I only learned about it myself last week when the investigator uncovered the payments. Uncle Michael stepped forward with his own stack of documents. While we're sharing family secrets, Robert, you should know that the IRS has been notified about your creative accounting. The offshore accounts in the Caymans, the shell companies in Delaware, the inflated charitable donations that went right back into your pocket. They're very interested in your last 7 years of returns. He smiled grimly. Oh, and those legitimate business expenses you've been writing off? Taking your mistress to Paris doesn't qualify, I'm afraid. My father sank into the visitor's chair, suddenly looking every one of his 62 years. You don't understand, he mumbled. Everything I did was for this family, to build something lasting. The delusion was breathtaking. He'd betrayed everyone who loved him, broken numerous laws, and nearly gotten me killed through his negligence, yet still saw himself as the victim. That's when James appeared in the doorway, his face flushed and breathing hard as if he'd run up the stairs. Dad, don't say anything else, he urged, shooting nervous glances at everyone in the room. Victor's lawyers are downstairs. They're filing an emergency injunction to freeze the company's assets. Someone leaked information about the federal investigation. He finally looked at me, and I saw guilt flicker across his features before he hardened his expression. This is your fault, Grace. If you'd just minded your own business, none of this would be happening. My fault? I laughed, though it hurt my ribs. I'm lying here with a metal cage holding my leg together because your business partner tried to kill me, and it's my fault. You've been selling out our family for a corner office, and it's my fault? I pressed the call button for the nurse. Security needs to escort these men out. I'm done being blamed for their crimes. As security arrived to remove them, Robert turned back one last time. You're destroying everything I built, he said, his voice hollow. My life's work, gone because you couldn't leave well enough alone. I met his gaze steadily. No, Dad. You destroyed it the moment you chose a business lunch over your daughter's life. I'm just cleaning up the mess. The war room was actually my hospital room transformed into a strategic command center. Laptops covered every surface, legal documents were taped to the walls, and a constant stream of lawyers, accountants, and investigators came and went at all hours. At the center of it all sat Samantha Rodriguez, the most ruthless corporate attorney in Chicago, whom my mother had retained within hours of our confrontation with Robert. Your father made a critical mistake, Samantha explained, her dark eyes gleaming with predatory satisfaction. By commingling personal and corporate assets, he's given us multiple avenues of attack. The RICO violations alone could result in asset forfeiture of everything he owns. She pulled up a complex flowchart on her laptop showing the web of connections between Robert's various enterprises, the offshore accounts, and Victor's embezzlement scheme. The first phase of our counterattack involved Lydia, Victor's soon-to-be ex-wife. When she learned that Victor had known about her affair with Robert for months and was using it as leverage, her desire for revenge exceeded even mine. She arrived at the hospital with boxes of documents she'd copied from Victor's home office, including his detailed plans for the hostile takeover and evidence of his own criminal activities that made Roberts look almost amateur by comparison. Victor's been planning this for 3 years, Lydia revealed, spreading out timelines and financial projections. He knew Robert would eventually get sloppy with his affairs and finances. He's been systematically weakening the company from within, driving away good employees, sabotaging projects to damage the reputation, all while documenting Robert's crimes to use as ammunition. She paused, then added with a vicious smile, he never expected anyone to document his crimes in return. My next move required technology and cunning. With the help of a private investigator who specialized in corporate espionage, we planted listening devices in my father's office during a weekend when we knew he'd be in Miami visiting his other family. What we captured over the following week was more damning than any of us had anticipated. Robert, panicking as the walls closed in, was recorded discussing plans to transfer assets to Swiss accounts and potentially flee the country. Even more shocking was a conversation between Robert and James where they discussed destroying evidence and bribing potential witnesses. Carlos needs to disappear, Robert was heard saying. Offer him money first. If that doesn't work, Victor knows people who can be more persuasive. That single recording would later become crucial evidence in the criminal conspiracy charges. Uncle Michael, meanwhile, had been working 18-hour days analyzing the financial records. His findings were staggering. Over $40 million had been stolen or hidden through various schemes over the past decade. But his most important discovery was that my mother, as a silent partner in the company's original incorporation, actually owned 49% of the business, not the 20% Robert had always claimed. He's been filing fraudulent documents for years, Michael explained, showing us the original partnership agreements. Diane's father provided the initial capital to start the company. Robert convinced her to sign papers that he said were for tax purposes, but they were actually attempts to dilute her ownership. Legally, those documents are void due to spousal fraud. She's technically been the primary owner this entire time. The media strategy was Samantha's idea. She had connections at every major news outlet in Chicago and knew exactly how to frame the narrative. The headline, "Construction Mogul Abandons Daughter in ER for Business Lunch," appeared first in the Tribune, followed by increasingly damaging revelations. The photo of my father's dismissive text message went viral, becoming a symbol of corporate greed and parental neglect. Mrs. Chen, the Japanese investor my father had been courting during my accident, reached out personally after seeing the news coverage. What she revealed was the final nail in Robert's coffin. "I recorded our entire lunch meeting," she said during a video call from Tokyo. "In Japan, we often record business discussions for clarity. Your father spent 20 minutes mocking you, calling you hysterical and attention-seeking while you were in surgery. He even joked that your accident was conveniently timed to interfere with his deal." The recording was devastating. Not only did it show Robert's callous disregard for my life, but he'd also made several racist comments about Asian business practices and bragged about his tax evasion schemes, apparently thinking Mrs. Chen wouldn't understand the implications. She understood perfectly and was disgusted. The Yamamoto Group immediately withdrew from all negotiations and issued a public statement distancing themselves from Robert's company. As our plan gained momentum, the rats began abandoning ship. Employees who'd suffered under Robert's tyrannical management came forward with their own stories. Several revealed that Victor had been promising positions in his new company in exchange for their loyalty, creating a shadow organization within our own corporate structure. One project manager provided emails where Victor explicitly discussed staging accidents to drive up insurance claims, suggesting my fall might not have been his first attempt at violence. The turning point came when we discovered James's vulnerability. My brother, for all his ambition, was still fundamentally weak. When confronted with the evidence of his betrayal and the reality that Victor was planning to discard him once the takeover was complete, he crumbled. In exchange for immunity from prosecution, he agreed to wear a wire and continue meeting with Victor, gathering the final pieces of evidence we needed. The trap was set. We scheduled an emergency board meeting, ostensibly for Robert to address the false allegations being spread in the media. Every major shareholder would be present, along with representatives from 3 government agencies who'd been quietly invited by Samantha. What Robert and Victor didn't know was that we'd already secured proxy votes from 60% of the shareholders, including several they thought were loyal allies. As the meeting approached, I was finally able to leave the hospital, though still confined to a wheelchair with months of rehabilitation ahead. The doctors warned that I might never walk normally again, that the nerve damage could be permanent. But physical pain paled in comparison to the satisfaction I felt knowing that my father's empire was about to crumble, and I would be there to watch every second of it. The boardroom at Preston Construction had never seen anything like the chaos that erupted that Thursday morning. What Robert and Victor expected to be a damage control meeting turned into an ambush of epic proportions. As I wheeled myself into the room, followed by my mother, Uncle Michael, and our legal team, I saw my father's confident expression falter. He hadn't expected me to be there, probably assumed I'd still be helplessly confined to a hospital bed. The meeting had barely begun when the doors burst open and federal agents flooded in. FBI, IRS, and SEC badges flashed as they announced their presence. "Robert Preston and Victor Mansfield, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, tax evasion, and violation of the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act." The look of shock on my father's face as they read him his rights was a moment I'd remember forever. But we weren't done. As the agents began securing documents and computers, Samantha stood to address the stunned board members. Ladies and gentlemen, in light of these developments and pursuant to Article 7 of the corporate bylaws, I call for an immediate vote of no confidence in the current leadership. The motion was seconded before she'd even finished speaking. What followed was a systematic dismantling of everything Robert had built through corruption and cruelty. Uncle Michael presented his forensic accounting analysis, showing slide after slide of embezzled funds, fraudulent invoices, and tax evasion schemes. The board members who'd arrived expecting to support Robert sat in stunned silence as the scope of his crimes became clear. Furthermore, my mother announced, standing with a dignity that made her look 10 feet tall, I am exercising my rights as majority shareholder to call for a complete restructuring of corporate leadership. The gasp from Robert was audible even as the federal agents were handcuffing him. That's impossible, he shouted. You own 20%. Diane smiled coldly. Actually, darling, I own 49%. Always have. You've been forging documents for years to hide that fact. Another federal crime to add to your collection. The vote was swift and unanimous, even those who'd been loyal to Robert couldn't deny the evidence. As the guards prepared to escort him out, my father made one last desperate attempt. Breaking free from the agent's grip, he lunged toward me, his face contorted with rage. You ungrateful bitch. I gave you everything. I made you who you are. Security tackled him before he could reach my wheelchair, but not before everyone in the room witnessed his true nature. That afternoon, the story exploded across national media. Billionaire dad attacks disabled daughter in boardroom dominated headlines, accompanied by security footage that someone had wisely leaked. The court of public opinion delivered its verdict swiftly and harshly. Robert Preston became the face of corporate greed and parental failure, his name toxic to anyone who'd ever done business with him. The following days brought revelation after revelation. The investigation uncovered a network of corruption that spread through dozens of construction projects across the city. Buildings with substandard materials, safety violations covered up with bribes, workers injured and silenced with threats. Carlos, our brave whistleblower, wasn't the only one who'd been documenting crimes. 17 other employees came forward with evidence once they knew it was safe. During a company-wide meeting held in the main warehouse, I addressed our 300 employees from my wheelchair. For too long, this company has operated on fear, greed, and exploitation. That ends today. The applause was deafening. When I announced that we were transitioning to an employee-owned cooperative model, grown men cried. Stock options for every worker, profit sharing, comprehensive health care, and a commitment to safety over profits. The Miami revelation became its own scandal. Brandon, my 17-year-old half-brother, reached out through his mother's lawyer. He'd grown up believing his father was a traveling businessman who could only visit occasionally. Learning the truth had shattered him. He told me he was building something for my future, Brandon said during our first phone call. Now I know he was just building another lie. James's complete breakdown happened during Victor's trial. On the witness stand, wearing a wire had given us crucial evidence, but the guilt had eaten him alive. He confessed to everything, the information he'd sold to Victor, the safety reports he'd falsified, even plans to frame me for embezzlement if I'd survived but been incapacitated. I wanted to be him, James sobbed, looking at our father in the defendant's chair. I wanted his power, his success. I didn't realize I was becoming his worst qualities instead. The criminal trials were swift. The evidence was so overwhelming that Victor's high-priced lawyers advised him to make a deal. He testified against Robert in exchange for a reduced sentence, revealing even more crimes we hadn't discovered. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. 23 charges for Robert, 19 for Victor. When the asset forfeiture was complete, the government seized $15 million in criminal proceeds. Houses, cars, boats, art collections, everything purchased with stolen money was gone. The legitimate assets that remained were transferred to the new employee-owned company, with my mother as chairwoman and me as interim CEO. The transformation happened faster than anyone expected. With workers finally having a stake in their own success, productivity soared. Projects were completed ahead of schedule and under budget. Safety incidents dropped to zero. Client satisfaction reached record highs. Mrs. Chen, impressed by our transformation, became our first international partner, bringing a $40 million contract that would employ hundreds. But the sweetest moment came during a quiet afternoon in my office. Nancy, my father's former secretary who'd stayed to help with the transition, brought me a letter that had arrived from the federal prison where Robert was serving his sentence. I recognized his handwriting immediately. "Don't you want to read it?" she asked. I looked at the envelope for a long moment, then dropped it into the shredder. "No," I said simply. "I've heard everything he has to say." The federal courthouse in downtown Chicago became my second home during the 3 months of legal proceedings. Every morning, despite the pain that still shot through my leg with each movement, I made sure to arrive early, positioning my wheelchair where Robert would have to pass me on his way to the defendant's table. I wanted him to see me, to be reminded that his choices had consequences that went far beyond financial ruin. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Assistant U.S. Attorney David Chen laid out 20 years of systematic fraud with the precision of a surgeon. Financial records, forged documents, recorded conversations, each piece of evidence building an insurmountable wall of guilt. But it was the human testimony that truly sealed their fate. Carlos took the stand on day 3, his weathered hands trembling as he held the Bible. Through a translator, he described years of witnessing safety violations, worker exploitation, and financial fraud. Mr. Preston would laugh about it, he testified. He would say Americans were too soft, that real money was made by cutting corners. When I saw him push his own daughter, I knew I had to speak up. If he could do that to his blood, what would he do to us? The recording from Mrs. Chen's lunch meeting played on day 5. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as Robert's voice filled the room, mocking me while I was in surgery. "She's always been dramatic, wanting attention. Probably threw herself down those stairs just to interrupt my meeting." His laughter on the recording, casual and cruel, made several jurors visibly recoil. Mrs. Chen testified via video link, her dignified presence a stark contrast to Robert's crude behavior on the tape. When my turn came to testify, I refused the prosecution's offer to wheel me to the stand. Instead, I struggled to my feet, using a cane to slowly make my way forward. Every step sent fire through my damaged nerves, but I wanted the jury to see what Victor's violence and my father's indifference had cost me. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear my labored breathing as I finally reached the witness chair. For 2 hours, I recounted not just the day of the accident, but a lifetime of being second to money. Missed recitals because of client dinners, birthdays forgotten for business trips, a mother's tears hidden behind closed doors. "My father taught me that love was conditional," I said, looking directly at him. "That it had to be earned through profit margins and stock prices. Even bleeding on a hospital floor wasn't enough to earn his attention if it conflicted with a business opportunity." The defense's strategy was predictable: paint me as a vengeful daughter trying to steal her father's company. Robert's attorney, a slick man named Harrison who'd defended corrupt politicians, tried to twist my words. "Isn't it true, Miss Preston, that you've always resented your father's success? That you orchestrated this entire situation to seize control?" I almost laughed at the absurdity. "Yes, counselor, I threw myself down 12 feet of scaffolding, punctured my own lung, and shattered my leg in 3 places, all for a clever corporate takeover. The months of agonizing physical therapy were just part of my master plan." Victor's decision to testify against Robert in exchange for leniency provided the most dramatic moments. He detailed their criminal partnership with the cold efficiency of a man trying to save himself. "Robert knew everything," he stated flatly. "Every inflated invoice, every bribe, every safety violation. He signed off on all of it. The only surprise was his daughter finding out. I panicked and pushed her. It was stupid, but I knew if she exposed the fraud, we'd both go down. The parade of employees who testified painted a picture of a toxic kingdom ruled by fear and greed. A project manager described being forced to use substandard concrete in a school building. An accountant revealed years of cooking books under direct orders from Robert. A safety inspector admitted to being paid to overlook violations that later resulted in worker injuries. Each testimony added another brick to the wall of justice closing in around my father. James's testimony was perhaps the most pathetic. My brother, granted immunity in exchange for his cooperation, looked like a ghost of his former self. He admitted to everything. Betraying family secrets to Victor, helping plan my accident, preparing to frame me if necessary. I thought if Grace was gone, Dad would finally see me as his true heir, he confessed. I didn't realize I was just another tool he was using. Victor told me Dad was planning to pin everything on me if the feds got too close. The character witnesses for the prosecution included community leaders, former employees, and even Brandon's mother from Miami. She testified about 17 years of promises, lies, and hush money. He said he was building a legacy for our son, she said quietly. But all he built was a foundation of lies. Brandon deserves better than a father who sees him as a financial obligation to be hidden. When the verdict came after 2 weeks of deliberation, I held my mother's hand as the foreman stood. Guilty. 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 23 times for Robert, the word echoed through the courtroom. Each count represented years in prison, fines that would strip away any hidden assets, and the complete destruction of the Preston name in the business world. Victor received guilty verdicts on 19 counts, his deal only protecting him from the most serious charges. The sentencing hearing a month later was Robert's last chance to show remorse, to acknowledge the pain he'd caused. Instead, he delivered a rambling speech about being persecuted for success, about ungrateful family members who'd conspired against him. Even the judge seemed stunned by his complete lack of accountability. Mr. Preston, Judge Williams said, in 30 years on the bench, I've rarely seen such a devastating combination of greed, cruelty, and narcissism. You betrayed every person who ever trusted you, including your own children. The sentence was harsh but just. 25 years for Robert, 15 for Victor. As the bailiffs led them away, Robert turned to look at me one last time. I expected to see hatred, maybe even threats. Instead, I saw something worse, complete incomprehension. Even facing decades in prison, he couldn't understand how choosing money over family had led to his downfall. After the courtroom emptied, I sat quietly with my mother and Uncle Michael. The war was over, justice had been served, but victory felt hollow. My leg would never fully heal. My relationship with my brother was destroyed beyond repair. The father I'd once idolized was revealed as a monster who saw his children as assets to be leveraged or liabilities to be minimized. Was it worth it? My mother asked softly. I thought about all the employees who now had fair wages and safe working conditions, about Brandon who could finally know the truth, about Carlos who was no longer afraid. Yes, I said finally. It was worth it. 6 months after the trial, I stood in front of the mirror in my office, barely recognizing the woman staring back. The wheelchair was gone, replaced by a sleek carbon fiber cane I only needed on bad days. Physical therapy had been brutal, but I'd approached it with the same determination that had carried me through the destruction of my father's empire. My leg would always bear scars, and cold weather brought aching reminders of Victor's violence, but I could walk. More importantly, I could stand tall. Preston Construction no longer existed. In its place stood Foundation Partners, an employee-owned cooperative that had become a model for ethical business practices in the construction industry. The transformation was remarkable. The same warehouse where Robert had once berated workers for taking sick days now housed a state-of-the-art wellness center. The break room where employees had whispered fears of termination now echoed with laughter and the sound of multiple languages as our diverse workforce shared meals together. Grace, you need to see these numbers, called out Maria, our new CFO and former accounts receivable clerk who'd proven brilliant when given the chance. She showed me the quarterly report with barely contained excitement. Profits were up 40%, but more importantly, workplace injuries were down to nearly zero, and employee satisfaction scores were the highest in the industry. Every worker owned shares in the company they were building together. My mother had found her own rebirth. The divorce settlement, combined with her recovered ownership stake, had made her wealthy beyond anything Robert had achieved through crime. But instead of hoarding it, she'd established the Second Chances Foundation, providing support for families affected by corporate crime and domestic betrayal. Her office, just down the hall from mine, was always full of people seeking help, finding hope. Brandon had become part of our rebuilt family in ways none of us expected. The teenager who'd discovered his entire life was a lie could have been consumed by bitterness. Instead, he spent his summer internship learning the business from the ground up, working alongside men like Carlos who taught him that real strength came from integrity, not intimidation. "I want to be everything he wasn't," Brandon told me one day over lunch. "I want to build things that last, relationships that matter." Carlos himself had been promoted to Director of Safety and Worker Advocacy, a position created specifically to ensure that no employee would ever again suffer in silence. His office door was always open, and workers trusted him completely. He'd implemented anonymous reporting systems, regular safety audits, and a zero-tolerance policy for retaliation. The man who'd once been too frightened to speak up was now the voice for hundreds. James had surprised everyone by actually learning from his catastrophic choices. After serving 6 months in minimum security, he'd emerged humbled and desperate to atone. He worked at a nonprofit teaching disadvantaged youth about business ethics, using his own fall from grace as a cautionary tale. We weren't close, might never be again, but I'd forgiven him. Holding on to anger was like carrying poison, it only hurt the person holding it. The Japanese partnership with Mrs. Chen's Yamamoto Group had exceeded all expectations. Not only did they bring substantial contracts, but they also shared innovative practices that revolutionized our operations. Mrs. Chen herself had become something of a mentor, teaching me that true leadership meant lifting others up, not stepping on them to climb higher. "Your father saw business as war," she told me during one visit. "You see it as cultivation. That's why you'll build something that lasts." The anniversary of the accident arrived with unexpected emotions. I stood on the rebuilt scaffolding where Victor had pushed me, now reinforced with triple safety barriers and surveillance systems. The workers had created a small memorial plaque, in honor of Grace Preston, who fell so we could rise. It was cheesy and grammatically questionable, but it moved me to tears. That evening, we held our first annual profit-sharing celebration. As I watched 300 employees and their families enjoying the fruits of their collective labor, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. It was a collect call from federal prison. Robert's voice sounded older, smaller somehow. "Grace, please, I need to tell you something." I almost hung up, but something made me listen. "I've been going to therapy here," he said, the words seemingly painful to speak. "The psychologist says I have something called narcissistic personality disorder. I'm learning about the damage I caused. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed you to know that I finally understand. When you called from the hospital, I should have dropped everything. A father's first job is to protect his children, and I failed completely." The apology I'd never expected to hear hung in the air between us. It didn't erase the pain or undo the damage, but it offered something I hadn't realized I needed: acknowledgement. "I hear you," I said finally. "I hope you find peace." Then I ended the call, knowing it would likely be our last conversation. The true measure of our success came during an emergency that tested everything we'd built. A worker's child was rushed to the hospital with a rare condition requiring immediate surgery. Word spread through the company, and within hours, employees had organized meal trains, childcare for the family's other children, and raised money to cover expenses insurance wouldn't. But the most powerful moment came when I was in a crucial meeting with potential investors worth millions. My assistant knocked and whispered about the situation. Without hesitation, I stood up. "Gentlemen, I apologize, but one of our family members needs us at the hospital. We'll have to reschedule." As I grabbed my coat, one of the investors looked stunned. "You're walking away from a $50 million deal for an employee?" I paused at the door. My father once chose a business lunch over his daughter's life. It cost him everything. I learned that when you put people first, the money follows. When you put money first, you lose everything that matters. I spent the night at the hospital with the worker's family, holding his wife's hand during the surgery, being present in the way my father never was. The child pulled through, and when I returned to the office the next day, I found a message from the investors. They were not only ready to proceed with the deal but wanted to increase their investment. They'd never seen a CEO walk away from money for an employee, and it told them everything they needed to know about our company's values. The cycle had been broken. Where Robert had sown fear, we cultivated trust. Where he had hoarded wealth, we shared prosperity. Where he had chosen profits over people, we proved that putting people first was the most profitable choice of all. The company that had nearly killed me had been reborn as something beautiful, something healing. Standing in my office as the sun set over the Chicago skyline, I thought about the text that had started it all. "I'm at lunch. Can't leave." 7 words that had cost my father $15 million, 25 years of freedom, and a family that might have loved him if he'd ever given them the chance. But those same 7 words had given me something priceless, the opportunity to build something better from the ashes of his greed. My name is Grace, and at 35 years old, I learned that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the worst betrayals. My father's abandonment freed me to become someone he could never be. A leader who understands that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the lives we touch and the love we share. He chose his lunch and lost everything. I chose love and gained the world. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey of heartbreak and triumph. If you've ever felt abandoned by someone who should have protected you, if you've ever questioned your worth because someone chose money over your well-being, I want you to know that you are valuable beyond measure. Your story matters, your pain is valid, and your future is not defined by someone else's failures. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever experienced a betrayal that ultimately led to something better? How did you find the strength to rebuild? Please share this story with anyone who needs to be reminded that choosing people over profit is always the right decision. Don't forget to like this video if it resonated with you, and subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories of overcoming adversity and finding redemption in the most unexpected places. Remember, sometimes the worst thing that happens to us becomes the catalyst for the best thing that could ever happen for us. Until next time, choose love, choose integrity, and